Welcome, everyone. I'm David Paparelli, the co-founder of M-Cultivo, and this is The Cupping Table. Over the next few weeks, we will be hearing from some of the best coffee producers in the world. They'll be sharing their stories, insights, and outlook on specialty coffee and what makes their coffee so unique. My guest today is the reborn Monk of Mokha. He claimed the name and in his own words said he would resurrect the art of Yemeni coffee and restore it to prominence. That was over a decade ago. I'm sure he had no idea what was to come, and I'm excited to learn what it came to mean today. Welcome, Mokhtar Alkhanshali. The first and the most important question to you today to start this thing off is just what coffee are you drinking today?
Today I am drinking a delicious coffee from Panama, actually. Good friends at Kotoa, Ricardo, his daughter. It was gifted by them and his daughter Victoria on my recent trip last month to Panama, and it's a delicious coffee. You know, that classic jasmine, geisha, floral, just a bouquet of flowers, and it just lingers in your mouth, and it's just a wonderful coffee. And it's also special when you visited the farm and you walked on the farm and you've met the people and you've had coffee with them and lunch, and they were so kind to welcome you to their home. So a lot of great memories and a lot of delicious notes in this coffee.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, it's so neat. We have so many friends in the coffee world in common. And that's not uncommon in coffee, right? But I don't think we've been able to spend significant time together. Obviously, I've read through a lot of your stuff. And one of the things you published on your blog recently was kind of the 5 ways to fall deeper in love and coffee. And one of those ways was to visit farms. I mean, what do you think that role plays, visiting farms and falling in love with coffee?
You know, I think it's similar to when people visit vineyards and you go and have this experience with it. And then when you see, when you go to a restaurant, if you drink wine, you see that wine in the restaurant, you have this connection with the place and the people behind it. So this coffee, actually, the name of the farm is Las Brujas. When you like taste the coffee, yeah, I'm tasting the nose, the coffee, and the flavors, but I'm also, in our brain, I think it's called olfactory glands, where our memories are stored. It's also where we find our taste receptors go to, and it's our memories and flavor and taste are always connected. So, for me, it's the coffee is delicious, but it's also it gives me just great memories to know that I am drinking something that reminds me of wonderful people in a wonderful place.
Yeah, you do hear that so often, even when people have that first experience. They'll say, "Well, I was on farm in Costa Rica and I had the best coffee of my entire life." And it was more about the experience than it was actually the profile, the flavor in the cup, right? And you get to capture that as you taste things in the future. You have that memory recall, which is so powerful. But today we're going to talk a little bit about Yemeni coffee, right? So, starting off, I mean, I got gratefully, this interview finally recorded been on my bookshelf for a while, but
Well,
this interview finally encouraged me to read your or the book, I guess, written about some of your experience, the Monk of Mokha. And a part of that book was talking about the birthplace, this debate around the birthplace of coffee, right? I love what it says, but I wonder if this has evolved since this book was written, that the birthplace of coffee is Ethiopia, with Yemeni being kind of the home of its first cultivation. Has that evolved at all, the history of that for you, or is it still the same as it was in the book?
it's interesting. The history of coffee is, unfortunately, very muddled and does not have as much clarity as a lot of coffees. And I remember a few years back at a Bloom symposium, I gave a talk on leaf rust, La Roya, but I was talking about the history of coffee, and it forced me to study and understand a bit more. And so I researched. I contacted the World Coffee Research Program, spoke to some wonderful scholars, and so the origins of coffee arabica start in this area called the Eastern Afro-Monte region, which is parts of South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Western Yemen. So that's kind of where it begins. For me, as someone who travels and spends time in Ethiopia and Yemen and a few other countries, when you go to Ethiopia, you see like, some farms have like 60 different varieties. They're, heirloom varieties,
Yeah.
and they grow wildly there. And so I think that I'm a big fan of history, and there's a wonderful cross-culture exchange between Yemen and Ethiopia. I mean, at one point with Pangaea, it was one continent. And so you see like the Aksumite Ethiopian Empire ruled deeply into Yemen. They actually used to have a cathedral in the capital. You see a lot of the Yemeni tribes. I met a lot of the Yemeni tribes and Sufi orders in Harar, Ethiopia. And so I think, and I'm probably one of the few Yemenis who thinks this, that coffee as a plant begins its journey in Ethiopia as a wild kind of shrub that grows there. I don't think the story of Chaldi and the discovery of coffee is the best, is as accurate as it should be. I think once I was talking to George Howell, and he mentioned that the story of coffee is much more elegant than just some goat herder and someone tasting some goats and coffee cherries and
Right.
kind of funky. It's actually a very deep, spiritual, beautiful story with poetry. In Yemen, the first coffee culture was around spirituality, people coming together and building a community. So the Yemeni tribes in the region of Ib, where my family is from, they go to Ethiopia quite a bit. And this monk of Mokha named Sheikh Ali ibn Umar, he goes in the mid 1400s to Ethiopia, marries an Ethiopian woman, and lives in Harar. And I remember once I was talking to a friend of mine, Marcelo Pereira, and we talked about how in Ethiopia you see the homes. A lot of times they're kind of huts with kind of dome shape, the old traditional homes, roofs. But if you go to Harar, it's different. They're flat roofs
Yeah.
that are perfect for sun drying coffee. And so he goes there and he finds coffee. I have this nonprofit called the Mokha Institute, and we held Yemen's first academic symposium 2 years ago in the University of Sanaa, Yemen. And there was a panel with a speaker named Dr. Abdul Wadud Makhshar. He's an amazing historian at the University of Hodeidah in Western Yemen. And I really wanted to be the moderator for that panel. And he gave an incredible lecture on the history of coffee and how this monk goes from Yemen to Egypt and then Ethiopia, finds them eating this shrub, these cherries. They didn't drink it. The early consumption was they would take it and wrap it with animal fat and kind of eat like a um, protein bar kind of thing, almost like a early keto diet.
Yeah.
And he figures out a way to make it into a drink, and to roast it. Arabs love roasting things on campfires. That traditional image of a Bedouin Arab with his tent and his campfire. And he takes the seeds back to Yemen, to Al Udain, a region where I'm from. My family's from Ib, the province of Ib, which is a very beautiful place. And he grows it there. They call it Udain, which in Arabic Udain means two twigs or two branches that grew. Some say it's coffee and khat. Some say it's two coffee plants. But in Yemen, the oldest variety you see across the country is the Udaini variety around it. So it's a longer conversation, but in short, I think a really wonderful quote that I heard was that coffee's birthplace is in Ethiopia. Its soul is in Yemen, where the first cup was poured. And that's kind of how I see it. And then commercialization of coffee and the first trade really began in Yemen. For 200 years, Yemen had this monopoly at the port of Mocha. No one knew that across the ocean there was coffee. I don't think they started growing coffee commercially into the 1800s in Ethiopia. But that's kind of a short recap to, what I think between, where coffee begins and its origin. It's really, it's a cross-cultural exchange between two wonderful places.
Yeah, I think it's a worthwhile. We'll get to this a little bit later, I hope, but it is a worthwhile pursuit to kind of understand the history of this. And I appreciate that you sort of started with the history and your interest. I mean, kind of jumping on the internet, researching all you could about coffee from a historical perspective, and then maybe sort of wandering into more specialty coffee shops and seeing about taste profiles and that sort of thing. And knowing where you've been to kind of figure out where you're going to go is important. You did mention, so you mentioned Port of Mocha, you mentioned Mocha Institute, and you have 4 farms. Can you give us kind of a brief overview of kind of all the things you have going on um, in business and nonprofits.
Yeah, and to talk about history, I was a big fan of history, and as a third culture kid growing up in America, I was constantly trying to figure out my identity, where do I belong, and when I found out about coffee and the rich history of Yemen, I kind of this was a wonderful thing to be proud of, and it's what drove me to kind of go towards this pursuit. For those interested, there's an incredible historian named Dr. Nancy She has a wonderful book called The Merchant Houses of Mocha that really brings it to life. And it was like, it's kind of like that movie, The Never Ending Story, where I'm reading this book and at one point I'm in the story. It's a great book. So for me, my coffee journey is a kind of evolution. I started working with farmers. I was one of the first to set up kind of collection centers and to help transfer knowledge to farmers to produce better coffee and to pay them more for those coffee cherries. And so that work included me just going and visiting lots of farms and training farmers and being on the ground there for many years. That evolved to a small farm. I can try you one, which is a farm in Haraz, Western Haraz. Really high elevation, wonderful place. And so I have my green bean business kind of categorized into these four different uh, farms where they're regions really. And so I'll go tell you one is the farm I operate and manage. And it's a small farm, less than 3,000 trees. And it's really for me to do the experiments I want to do and things that, there's an interesting thing with coffee processing. I think that, when you look at coffee, what impacts the flavor, it's always the, I think the elevation is probably the biggest impact usually. And then the variety, and then the processing of the coffee. And it's a double-edged sword because if you process too much, you lose the uniqueness and the soul of the coffee, the unique flavor notes. I've tasted coffees that I can't tell if it's from Kenya or from Colombia, from Yemen, because it's so fermented. And so it's a challenge. But at the same time, if you're able to figure out how to do it and the farmer can make more money, I'm always on the side of the farmer. As long as there's transparency and letting people know how you produce this coffee. Did you add any additives to it in the yeast, fermentation or other things, and just be transparent about that. But it's a tricky thing, and I've definitely gone from like trying all these funky fermentation experiments. We're kind of in this wild west of fermentation now, where um, I went to a vineyard to understand a bit more about wine fermentation, and it's so advanced. The way they have they have these
Yeah.
special tanks that have coils that control the temperature. They pick the grapes at night so it doesn't ferment in the sun. Like all these things they do, and so we have unfortunately a big gap between science and coffee processing that a lot of people are actually trying to bridge those gaps. A lot of wonderful producers. A lot of them are in this auction, which I was pretty happy to see. Like Mercio Shatta, Willem Boot, all these wonderful farmers that have been teachers for me. And so Alcatraz 2, 3, and 4 are different regions that I work with. Those are more collection centers, knowledge transfer, microloans in those spaces. And they're less experimenty. I'm focused more on the traditional methods of drying there. Some farmers, it's hard for a farmer to, first of all, it's really risky. I don't recommend any farmer to start fermenting and doing these crazy things because I've seen, unfortunately, many farmers do these things and the coffees do not come out the way they should. It's an
Yeah.
experiment at the end of the day, and they get put in a really bad position, afterwards, especially when buyers back out because the coffees don't taste great. And if you are a roaster out there and you push a farmer to do a certain fermentation or certain process, you should commit to buy it regardless of the outcome because the farmer is, trusting you. I've seen some great examples of this roaster called Chromatic in San Jose, California. There was a farmer in Kenya that only did washed. We know that beautiful double A Kenyan washed process. It's like malic and just green apple. He told him to do natural. Farmer had never done natural, and he paid him. I think it was $11 a pound, which is a lot more than he was paying for the
Yeah.
washed. That year, I think it was 2 years ago. It was one of the best coffees I had that year. Phenomenal. And the farmer switched the next year to like 30% of his coffee is natural. And then he lowered the price down to like, I think $5 or $6, because it made more sense at that point. But it was that roaster who took the risk with the farmer. So I have these different regions I work with. And then I start to notice that a lot of the people benefiting from the coffee trade in Yemen where there was like this elephant, or in our case, camel in the room, were Yemenis who had foreign passports, British or UAE or US passports, and they could speak English. They can go to trade shows. And the majority of the exporters in Yemen cooperatives, they don't have access to those trade shows because the Yemeni
Okay.
passport is not as strong, unfortunately, and they don't speak English. And so I noticed that the coffee country was actually declining in quality. And so I decided to, start the nonprofit, the Mocha Institute, brought on some really wonderful advisors on board. And then the first, project we launched was to do a national auction. I did Yemen's first private auction in 2018. And since then, there have been several other companies that have done auctions a couple years later. And I'm really proud of like the prices we've commanded, starting that kind of trend and doing it. But the difference between a private auction and a national auction is that in a private auction, it's my coffees, or I buy the coffee from the farmers. Now it's my coffees, and then I sell it to buyers. Where a national auction, it's the farmers who directly sell to the buyers. And so we submitted this to the authorities in Yemen, the local authorities, and they did a call out for proposals. We won this bid to do it, and it cost me a lot more than I thought it would. It was something that almost bankrupted me, but it was a year and a half project that I'm probably one of the things I'm most proud of in my life. Like, to get all the Yemeni exporters to work together. We developed Yemen's first coffee lab in the capital. We brought in EK43 grinders and scales, and we trained the first national cupping team with incredible people on the ground. The head of the Yemeni Export Association at that time, Rashid Shuja. We had the Union of Coffee Cooperatives by Mohammed Hassan, they have 28 cooperatives that represent 40,000 farmers. We held Yemen's first festival for coffee. That this is the third year they're doing it now. It was just a lot of things that happened in that, and I was just really happy to do that and develop to do that project. And it was successful at the end of it. And so um, that's kind of my world. And Port of Mocha is a company here in the US where it's a direct consumer company where we roast. We're lucky to work with some incredible coffee roasters here around the country, around the world. And so this is a separate business where we sell coffee gifts to folks who read the book, hear about my story. It's really a small online store that sells high-end gifts for people who are really exceptional and exceptional packaging. We hired some people say our boxes are very similar to the iPhone box because we hired the same designer, Todd
Yeah,
Fab,
yeah. I've seen
and
it.
so on.
Yeah.
And and the trilogy box, I still think it's the most beautiful coffee gift box. And so, I didn't plan to do it this way, but it's challenging being vertically integrated and working on the farm level, which is very difficult. Just processing, collecting, milling, exporting, importing, dealing with Red Sea issues and international trade. And then you have selling to roasters, trade shows, and now you guys are doing this wonderful auction, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then roasting coffee and packaging and selling online, like it's been challenging, but we've been able to work with some wonderful people. In 2017, Dragonfly Roasters roasted our coffee. We received a 97-point coffee review. We're number one coffee in the world that year, which is the
Wow.
first
Okay.
time a Yemen coffee ever scored that high in the coffee review, and hasn't since then. That was a big deal for me. I was really happy to have achieved that. And yeah, so I love coffee in its entirety. I do everything coffee that I love. I don't do retail. I think that's it takes a lot of heart to do retail, and I don't think you just can't spread yourself that thin, and it's just like really hard. And so I'm lucky to work with wonderful people who can tell the story of farmers and roast the coffee the best way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's a difficult thing. I think in coffee, people do tend to get um, sucked into basically running 3 or 4 different businesses as they move along. You mentioned, Will and Boot. I know he lived through that experience too, of kind of roastery, cafe, back to farm level, down to working for NGOs, that sort of thing. You've done a lot of the same. I would be curious, because you're so connected to the market, and very, very few Yemeni coffee farmers, unfortunately, are, and farmers around the world, unfortunately, are. There is this idea that has come out that was very early when you started, of kind of a social business. right? And what a social entrepreneur is. You've kind of operated in this spectrum, right? Of, I think it says in your book, initial concept was labeled as a nonprofit, and your mentor was like, "Don't do that. That's stupid. Do like make money and make it sustainable, right?" Then you got pure for profit, which there's a gravity to that, right? You have to make money to keep things going. You build a team, you have to make more money, you have to do that. Are you still, with all these businesses and all this kind of vertical integration going on from roasted coffee all the back to the farm level, are you still able to keep kind of that foundational mission? What is the tension there that you have to fight on that spectrum? And has that worked? How do you do that?
It's actually a very good question, and I've never been asked that question. So I'm going to speak out loud here, and it's going to be unfiltered. But to think out loud and say, I think we all have to define what our North Star is. For me, it was I wanted to uplift Yemeni farmers. I wanted to change their quality of their coffee and lives through their coffee. And so that meant knowledge transfer. And so initially, I was like, I'm going to do a nonprofit. That's what I want to do. I wasn't really interested in making like money that way. But then when I saw the nonprofit industrial complex, which is a term I've heard over and over again, it's unfortunate because what happens is you have donors who decide what should be worked on and not the people who are being afflicted. And then all these people have to fit within these boxes, instead of trying to fit within what they need, their support. And then the other problem is a lot of the donor organizations, they create a form of dependency where people have to constantly try to,
Hmm.
they need to if the funding goes away, there's no sustainability. They just collapse, and I love the idea of teaching someone how to fish. Don't give them fish. So when I found that out, I'm like, okay, this is not going to work out. And that's why one of my advisors early on told me that you should focus on a for-profit model, because that's more sustainable. And it should, and it's not charity. People work really hard to produce these coffees, and people love these coffees, will pay more for it. And so that was kind of my goal. So that's always been my kind of line throughout the whole thing. And so everything I do has to fit through that angle and that approach. And so, for example, I would love to plant 1 million coffee trees in Yemen a year. I can't do that right now. My company, we're not that large to do that. And so I have people who have approached me, who have read my book, who follow me, say, I really believe in what you're doing. I don't really drink coffee, but can I support you? And so I decided to create this vehicle, which is the Mokha Institute, at a way to hey, we can do these projects in Yemen to, the first project was the national auction, because I felt that the industry was a bit fragmented. I wanted them to come together. I wanted to produce, create a window. We could actually call it the window for hope. That was the name of the auction, where if we can create a market and access to a market, people will produce more coffee. Now they have a way to do that now. And because now they do. I've stepped away from the auction for 2 years now. This is the third year now. I've been all out of it. And it's wonderful to see it continue and to grow even than when we first started. So I everything I do has to kind of fit in that angle. And then also just the angle of how to expand it a bit more now, how to help farmers in general. I have a privilege, I think, and a responsibility being between the consumer world and producer world. And I see the issues happening here, and I see still a lot of problems that are happening. I still think that like in coffee is still being sold for a cheaper price than it should be when you compare it to other beverages or other industries. And I think that a lot there's room for innovations and to do some disruption. So I'm hoping to work more on that. But in short, my goal is like how to help farmers get paid more and how to do that sustainably. And most of it is done through for profit, because for me the best way to really uplift people is to develop them and help them become economically independent and successful. But sometimes, and it happens, you need a nonprofit. In California, we just had a bunch of fires. Like, you need nonprofits to, come during disaster relief. You need nonprofits to do certain things that for-profits don't do. Hopefully I get to a place one day where I make enough money and I have a surplus where I can afford to fund a nonprofit and have a foundation, but we're not there yet. But until then, I still, for me, if for people who are interested in supporting there's that way to do it through the nonprofit world.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. There's just, there's definitely points of just market failure, right? Where you just have inability for businesses to step into these environments and actually create, real economic sustainability. How do you pay farmers more, right? If you're in a war-torn area and you need to get coffee out, there's logistical challenges. There's all this stuff going on, right? I find find that so interesting. And what you've been able to do is this sort of unique situation where you're able to step into maybe historically when you stepped into the Yemeni coffee scene, there was a lot of optimism, right? I'm sure that optimism has ebbed and flowed over the last decade, but you've stayed consistent and been able to offer an economic solution along with other solutions, but primarily an economic driven solution that could work decades into the future, right? Do you see that over your last kind of decades of experience, the ebbs and flows of optimism for Yemeni, and then just your persistence paying off at this point, or is there just less hope and more to do at this point in your life?
I was talking to a friend of mine, and she's an incredible leader in the development world in Yemen. Her name is Sophia Al Jabari. She's the executive director of a really important nonprofit called SMEPS, which stands for Small Economic Micro Promotion Services. And they're like been a leader in development projects in throughout Yemen with fisheries, with honey producers, with coffee producers. Really incredible work. And so, we're kind of lamenting and then going over like the situation, our lives and our work. And I realized, I said this, there's an old Arabic poem. It says, وَمِنَ الْحُبِّ مَا قَتَلَ. And some love can kill you. And so like, I think a lot of times it's the love of the country and the people that help push you and keep you going, because sometimes it's just difficult. You do everything you want to do, and there's political realities that are out of your control. And sometimes even the people themselves, they ruin it themselves. Your own people, they cause issues, and there's infighting and and all these different things. And at the end of the day, if you have an intention to do something good work, you just do it for that sake, not for other reasons. Because monetarily, sometimes it's not. I mean, when I've looking at the Yemen and looking at the infrastructure, the instabilities, the rivaling faction, the different governments. I mean, this is like the worst place to do any business. And so, what makes so many exporters in Yemen work in Yemen? And if you look at all these wonderful exporters, the other ones that were around the world, like Hamdani Coffee, Nuruddin, the Haraz Coffee, Ghalib, all these wonderful producers, exporters, it's more about love because they all of them have other businesses they make money from, and then coffee is like a side thing they do just because they love do working in coffee. There's a romanticism. It's part of our identity. It's a 500-year-old brand in Yemen in coffee. There's poetry. There's so many of our experiences as children around coffee plants and our families. And so I think that, we have wonderful moments that are really wonderful. I had some wonderful moments and hopefully I'll have more in the future. Then I have some horrible moments, where it's like, just like right now, things are starting to calm down. Just today, Ansarallah, the Houthis announced that they're allowing, American and British vessels to run through the Red Sea. And last week they released the hostages. They had it for 14 months, which they were taking care of pretty well, it seems like. And things are getting more calm because it affected Ethiopian trade, Kenyan trade, coffee. It affected actually 100. The Economist had an article last month, $175 billion. And that's because, the Yemeni people wanted to support and fight against this oppression in Gaza and Palestine was happening there. And so it came at a cost. So I think that, as you said, and I think in life in general, you have happy moments and sad moments. And so what keeps us going in this thread is just a pure love for the country and the people, and in hoping that and I think in coffee, the people that I look up to and talk to, I think I was talking to Helen from Equator Coffee, a wonderful founder and just an amazing business woman and leader, and she said, if you make a lot of money in coffee, you're probably not doing it right. So it's like this weird kind of dialectic relationship. You said it earlier. It's like a tension between the two. It's like it's especially coffee, because especially coffee is about transparency, traceability, uplifting farmers, producing the best quality coffee, the highest, which can go against a lot of CFOs who want to just bottom line and scale and make it. So it's like and we've seen that a lot of companies start off in a certain way, then as they scale, they kind of unfortunately change in that regards. But I don't know. I hope I'm just riffing here, and I mean, no one's ever asked me that question. I appreciate you for asking it, so I hope this made
No,
sense.
I'd like to, yeah, and I'd like to kind of blow that up a little bit. I'm going to completely butcher this, but you mentioned another poem at some point. that said something like Yemeni coffee or pearls on the trees. Those who grow it will never taste hunger or humiliation. I don't know if I got that right or completely wrong.
True, actually. It's a great
But
it's his name is the late poet Ali Mutahar al-Iryani. He died a couple of years ago during the war, and he is one of the Yemen's most important poets. And there is an area called Iryan, a famed coffee region. And so only somebody who loves coffee can write those words. It's a beautiful poem called Love and Coffee, Al-Hubb wal-Bun.
yeah,
Long poem that talks about the harvest, coffee harvest, and that what happens there, and the birds that that fly drunkenly from the nectar that they from the coffee trees, and the women and the men who they have them they meet and they like have these like flirty moments. And in that poem he has this wonderful line it's like an internal line of poetry where he says, "Oh coffee, oh pearls on the trees," like that's how he looked at them. Whoever grows, you'll never taste of hunger or humiliation. بن اليمن يا الدرر يا كنزي بغى الشجر من يزرعك ما افتقر ولا ابتلى بالهواني. And it's like it's such a I think for me, if you really want to understand the psyche of a people, you can always go to their poetry and see how they think
yeah,
through that, how they feel. And so that's the place Yemeni coffee has in our society. It's just so it's funny. A lot of Yemenis don't even realize is like I told them, look at your passports. We have like this coat of arms is an eagle. We Google Yemen coat of arms, and I said, look at the center, and you can see in the chest it has a coffee branch with coffee cherries on it. It's like everywhere in our culture, in our society, and so it's a really great part of Yemeni culture because it talks about a history and a legacy that
but
I'm glad to
what
see
I
it thriving now, even here in the U.S. now and around the world. A lot of Yemeni cafes now here, coffee shops opening up, and just people continuing this now.
yeah, and I mean, what I love about that poem is it's such a concise, kind of beautiful purpose statement, maybe for the industry. If I could kind of extend it outside of Yemen culture and that, and what I'm curious on your perspective on is there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of heart in coffee, right? That can often be misdirected. That can be either it can be misinterpreted, but it can also be damaging, right? Talked about nonprofits doing handouts instead of kind of this hand up kind of idea or support kind of idea. Where do you think um where do you think specialty coffee has sort of failed in that purpose statement? And where can we do better?
Here, no, I think I'm more hopeful, and I'll talk about that towards the end of this sentence here or this paragraph. I'm going to say basically, I think that in the cafe structure, it's hard because the traditional place of a cafe was a community space where people came and they used it, and it reflected the arts and the crafts, the people there. Lloyd's Bank was a cafe. In France, there were for philosophers and for writers. The Green Dragon in Boston was a place where American political radicals got together and planned the Boston Tea Party and so forth. Even later on, like in the 60s, you had these kind of cafes like Cafe Triste, San Francisco, or Reggio, New York. And so I think from that point of view, there no longer are it's no longer a third space or a community
Yeah.
place. People come in, get their coffee, and leave. And I think that that's one issue. The other issue is that I think oftentimes we focus on the technical aspects of coffee, the coffee score, the varietals, and everyone keeps talking about these things, and it really goes over a lot of customers, heads. Where a good example of a way to market and to tell story. I think stories are so powerful and they connect more deeply than this kind of information that's just on these bags. Like who actually produces coffee? These farmers were not just farmers; they also have other lives too, and they're very interested. And I think when a consumer can see themselves in the people and relate, it's more powerful. I think a good example of like Steve Jobs and Apple, there was a talk he gave where like he did this huge campaign for their computers, and they were on the cover, I think, or in the New York Times, and they spoke about how many gigahertz and how many megahertz their computers were, how much better they were than IBM and so forth. And they actually didn't make any money that quarter. They lost money. So then he started this other idea of just, thinking about two words, think different. and it was about celebrating amazing people who thought different. Albert Einstein, Amelia Earhart, Martin Luther King, Muhammad Ali. People actually didn't use Apple products until today. There's a connection with Apple products, and it's a very powerful one. Same with Nike. They don't talk about how much their shoes or sneakers make you run faster or higher. They never do that. It's always celebrating great athletes. And so I think that in coffee, that's probably the biggest thing I can tell any producer, I mean, any roaster or cafe. If you can just really go deeper into the stories of the farmers, they're real people. They're not just people with dirty hands who pick cherries. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, I see this kind of commodification of farmers. It's not really a great way at all to look at somebody. They're more than just some of their products, their coffee. I think that, but on the other hand, I do see this really cool stories of really wonderful people who are reflecting these kind of things. I mentioned like Systems File in LA. There's like a company, Substance Cafe in Paris. There's uh, what's the coffee in London? There's a really wonderful special guests. There's all these different folks doing that, and people who come from industries outside of coffee. Like my friend Nasser Mesraki from Cartel Roasters in Abu Dhabi. He works for the government. And he starts the incredible cafe concept. My friends Cairo Coffee Collective also, they left Canada and their lives in Canada to go to Cairo and start cafes. In Houston, my friend at Blending Roasters, he has a PhD in molecular cell biology. And so it's like I started seeing these people who are leaving, their traditional industries and jumping into coffee with fresh eyes. And Bartholomew from Black Coffee, another one in Memphis who was actually in music. Everyone has their own kind of like angle, so it's kind of nice seeing this. But my general advice is try it. It takes more time. It's easy just get an importer, give you green beans, and you have the elevation, the varietal, the flavor notes. But if you just contact the farmers through WhatsApp, get the information,
Yeah. Yeah.
interview them. Who are you? You have these people in your cafes. You should get to know them a bit more. And trust me, they have like incredible stories like that will really, make you feel that you know them a lot more.
Yeah. It's so powerful. I mean, I've heard it described as kind of poverty porn, where you're sort of showing farmers that are, you know, dirty hands for whatever it is, just to kind of, okay, so you buy this bag, and I guess you help this farmer, sort of thing. May or may not happen, the help for the farmer, but that's sort of the message out there. And I think what I've loved about our experience, and we kind of fell into auctions, right, with our model, and what I've loved about that is it's the antithesis to that, right? It's
Wow.
like, no,
Yeah.
these are some of the best producers in the world. You know, I know we draw comparisons to vineyards and wine often, but they really are more kind of estate owners that are running great businesses. And then the other thing that I do appreciate about what you said is just it takes curiosity from the market side down, right? Where you might have cafe owners, you might have roasters that lack the curiosity to even reach out to the coffee producers or coffee farmers that are making the product and truly understand what's going on there. But I think it goes the other way too, right? I mean, being a farmer or producer and having curiosity, what does the market actually want? What are buyers actually talking about? And I think that's so important. And I think that's been a differentiator in the people that we've talked to over the last several weeks just for this Dubai coffee auction is what has made, Mokhtar different or Willem Boot different or Deteja different. And a lot of it is just years and years of kind of listening to the market, not reacting to too much, but staying the course, listening to the market, and then trying to adapt their material marketing messaging and products to better serve their customers, right? Do you feel that and how you built your business? Where am I wrong there?
I think you're right. And that's why I think auctions are so important. And in Yemen, for example, the national auction, one of the main key players and leaders in Yemen at that time was until now Mohammed Al Qasimi from the Unity of Coffee. And for him, I remember we interviewed him. He said, for us, we want people to understand that we have beautiful gems in this country. There are beautiful stories, and people produce wonderful things that were not just what the media says. And the auction allows the very best to be produced and showcased. And internally, it allows for a country to push the limits of quality, because at the end of the day, there's going to be a return for them. Because in the past, like, okay, what's the point of me picking red cherries and doing all this extra work? But then you say, hey, look what's going on. You get to be part of this auction, and so they fight. And I've seen it happen in Ethiopia, with the Cup of Excellence in Ethiopia. I can tell you right now, like to like the first auction, I think 4 or 5 years ago, the quality of Ethiopian coffees have gone up dramatically, and the prices too. You know, and of course, Panama is the best example. At that symposium in Yemen I did a topic titled "The Story of Panama," and I gave an example of, Panama is very similar production to Yemen. I said, in 1996, after 1989, when the global coffee price happened, this crisis happened, the Panama farmers got together and they decided to start an organization to unify. They figured out we have to figure it out together, and they started SCAP, Specialty Coffee Association of Panama, and they brought on a consultancy, and they said, how can we raise our prices? How can we uplift our farms? They said you should do a competition, and they came up with the auction. And I remember talking to Rachel Peterson and Daniel when they discovered this geisha coffee, and they said that they were afraid to put it on the cup and table, And so this is an example of one auction that really changed the whole world and impacted me in Yemen, created opportunity for me to do what I do. Really, it tasted so different. They weren't sure if it was good or bad. And when the coffee cuppers that at the time, I think Owen Thompson, I think Bob Fulmer, I think it was Barry Levain, Kentaro Mariyama, they were there, and they were like, "This is one of the most amazing coffee I've ever had." It doubled the price of the coffee that year in the auction. I think it was $1.67 to like $2.67, which was huge at that time. Pound,
Right.
not
Yeah.
200, two dollars
Yeah.
and 7 cents. And the following year, I remember Rachel Peterson was telling me the story. It reached $11 a pound in the middle of the auction. She thought there was a mistake. There's something wrong with the system.
Yeah.
They stopped the auction, but they realized, no, there was actually somebody who was going to pay $11. And then a couple of years later, eventually it reached $300 a pound. And from that, people start to understand, like, develop a Q grading system and all these different things. And so I think that auctions are very, very challenging. And people, who are listening to this or watching this, as someone who's organized auctions, I don't think there has been an auction that we've organized that we haven't pushed back the date at least once, because there's so many moving parts. It's so high stakes. It's a lot of different things happening, and it's the livelihoods of people. The Panama auction was over $200,000. Was the winner last year, the Alita Coffee. That's life-changing money for anybody,
Yeah.
not just in Panama. If you're in America or London. And
Yeah.
so it's a lot at stake. And it's also, the issue with auction is that it's a trust between a farmer and a platform, and and a customer. And so if the platform doesn't work, and there's a bid happening, and it does something malfunction, which has happened in the past in some auctions, it is devastating for everybody, for this whole thing. And so the work you guys are doing is really important. I think this auction also, a couple of years ago, I was talking to Wilford and a few friends of mine. Like, this idea is like, it's really historic to bring. I didn't realize I submitted these coffees, these two lots that I was really proud of, and it wasn't until I think 2 days ago someone posted a video of the coffees, and I see my coffee alongside. It's like Gesha Village and La Mula and all these, like, and Marcio Shutta, all these wonderful producers. I'm like, this is really historic to have kind of like the Oscars, or kind of like the all-star of the world coffees in one place. And I don't know of an auction, because there's West of Panama, there's like Cup of Excellence, there's our Yemen coffee auctions, but to have them together is really unique experience. And I kind of have a question, like, what made you guys decide to take on this
Well,
endeavor?
yeah,
Because it's
I mean,
really,
so first of all, yeah, on the tech side. So we came at coffee. I mean, I've been in coffee a while, but this company, we came at coffee from a tech angle, right? Essentially, the Cup of Excellence came to us with a problem. We said, yeah, we think we've been building technology. We think we can help, you know, and so there's in the context of that, there's you know 2 decades of technology failures in coffee auctions. You mentioned Best of Panama. One of many was, and not beating up on Best of Panama, one of many was prices went to $100 a pound, or $100 a kilo, I think. the auction wasn't set up to handle prices above $100 a kilo, so it just crashed. It was just the end of it. It couldn't do it. So we've been doing this. Our first step into this was we'll run these. This is kind of how we approach a lot of things in specialty coffee, because we want to have respect and reverence for what's been done before. It's like, let's just run these auctions and let's learn from people. So let's we'll build the technology. We'll do everything we can to support people the best we can, coffee producers the best we can. But let's not jump in and start innovating right away. I mean, that's just that's not how we want to learn first and kind of act second, just to make sure we're not breaking things that are actually good things, right? Well, this idea of doing an international event like this came up, and the initial reaction was, well, that'll never work because Panamanians don't want to be compared to Yemeni and Ethiopians, and because they don't actually want to know who's the best coffee in the world. And if you put them on the table, then you'll really find out that Yemeni coffee is the best in the world. And then who would want that, right? That might be bad press for everyone else. But there was an evolution in the industry happening where these private producers, like yourself, were kind of moving beyond maybe their country brands. It's not a Panamanian producer with Finca Sofia and La Mula. It is, I don't want to degrade that, but it's also just Finca Sofia or La Mula. It's also, Port of Mokha. It's also, it's a little bit above. There's kind of a life of its own taking on. And so we took on this project by basically the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center reached out and said, we want to do an auction at the World of Coffee Dubai. And we said, great. And what do you want to do? We don't take on every auction because there is such high risk and it can go poorly, right? So what are your ideas? And they said, we don't have any ideas. We'd love for you guys to tell us some of your ideas. And we said, well, had this idea kicking around in the back of our mind. We have a great network of producers. We've been running auctions for several years. Is there something we could do to get these producers together in one auction? So I don't know. Let's field it to some. And so we came up with a list and we said, these are some of the best producers in the world. Let's just reach out to them and ask. And we got very little pushback. Most were like, this is a great idea. We'd love to do it. What's the next step? And that to me tells me that the industry is moving into more of a co-opetition sort of environment where it's kind of, we can cooperate together and then grow this thing. So, long story short, it was more of, I don't think it was an innovative idea. I don't think it was novel. I think a lot of people have had the idea, but I think it's, a lot of what you've experienced too. It's somebody has to do it though. And somebody has to take the first step and kind of get it together.
You guys are like kind of the nucleus, because I remember, for me, the way I found out about it was I was in Panama last month and visiting these coffee farms, and for me, it's always been like this wonderful cross-cultural exchange, like whether it's my friends in Panama or my friends in Colombia or Ethiopia. And it's interesting because the same farmers and producers are in this auction that just are naturally just friends. We share our notes, we figure things out. And by the way, there's some people who don't even participate in their own auctions internally in the country. They're just kind of afraid. They're afraid to like that they won't rank. And so that's the thing about competition. You just kind of, see who's out, who's the best and what happens. Maybe this year it's me, maybe next year it's you. So I remember I got up really early one morning and I go into, I go into the kitchen and I see Graciano Cruz, which he's like this kind of like, rainbow that appears like magically at different places in the world, because you never know where he's going to be. You meet him somewhere, he's not there, you think he's going to be there, but it was the only time I saw him the entire time I was in Panama, 2 weeks plus weeks. That one brief morning I walked in, I saw him in the kitchen with Willem Booth and Nolan from Proud Mary, another amazing roaster. And then they were speaking to Ibrahim from Espresso Lab in Dubai, something auction, world auction, this and that. And then they're like, Willem's like, you should be part of this if you want to. I'm like, well, I have this one, because we're ending the harvest now, but we had this one fly crop, and I had these 2 lots that could be, good coffees, and one of them in particular was really phenomenal. And so that's how I found out, and it's a camaraderie between us, and I think it's a healthy competition. It's just, I think, just fun to be a part of it. For me, whether I'm the lowest ranking one or the highest, just to be part of that box and part of this auction, it's great. I think our coffees are pretty unique and just have certain things that make them very unique, whereas, Panama Geisha has that beautiful jasmine florality. we have, which is more delicate and elegant. We have beautiful just body and lactic creaminess with this kind of dried fruits. And then because of the process techniques that I did, this kind of anaerobic slow dry natural, which I learned by the way from Wilfred Lemestas, the ASD it's great because you ferment it, in an anaerobic process for 2 to 4 days, so it's not super fermented, and you keep it in a cold environment. But then you dry it slowly for 2 to 3 weeks after that, and you at least get a lot of that terroir natural flavors in it. So you can at least it gives a uniqueness to it. And so yeah, that's that coffee that we sold a sister lot to Onyx Coffee last year. They sold, I think, it was 5 ounces for $150. It was an amazing coffee we did with them. We sold another sister lot to Foodway Bob's in Santa Monica from that coffee lot. Just a wonderful coffee. And so it's wonderful to see, like, now it's, going to be at this auction. Also, DMCC and Salim, the manager behind it, awesome guy. He's always thinking differently. And if you ever get a chance when you're in Dubai, go to DMCC and look at the coffee center there. Andrew Hertzlow was like the consultant. It's like, I believe it's a $25 million facility, probably more now. They have a roller grinder. They have and a lot of coffee companies are based through that. It's a really incredible place for coffee. And the fact that they reached out to you is also indicative of their forward thinking. And so shout out to all the wonderful people at the MCC Coffee.
Yeah, no, they've been great partners, and really it does. I mean, people got to do the work, but it takes an accelerant, right? You got to have that first step. And these coffees, I think you're right. I mean, we didn't rank them worst to best or anything like that. This isn't a traditional competition in that way, like so many coffee auctions are. It's just, you know, we've been saying some of the best from each country. There's a Kona coffee that's 500 meters from Hawaii that tastes amazing. I mean, it
Wow.
just is delicious. And then that's next to a Yemen cup. So you get to the cupping
That's
table, and it's just
crazy.
an
That's
exciting.
crazy. Just thinking about that, like Hawaiian coffee with Ethiopian coffee with the pennant that's just in itself is really historic and fun.
It's just a really. Every time I cup, I've had the privilege of cupping it 3 times at this point. That table, and it's just fun. I mean, I think part of what we miss in coffee is you get into Q grading, you get into what's the definition of specialty, the definition of co-fermentation, or what is it. You get lost. See market prices. You get lost in all the technicalities. It's like you kind of have to remove to that, regress, like you said, to that community element where you're just drinking coffee together, and it's just kind of fun and communal and what it should be.
People would pay for that experience to taste some of the world's best coffees, that are on the table, um, or just that diversity of coffees and the story behind that. I think that'll be really fun. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to that. That's
You'll be able
yeah. So
to
that
you'll definitely be able to cup them. So will you be? You'll be in Dubai. I should have asked you this before, or will you?
I don't know if I'm gonna make. I've been to every year. From the first year they had it to last year I was a speaker, and 2 years in a row I was a speaker in it. And so I have to make a decision very soon about this. And I'll probably next day or two.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
we'll if you as a I don't know if it's an Easter egg or a carrot. We'll set up a cupping for you if you do make it out. That'll be amazing.
I mean, that's it definitely would probably turn the tide here, but it's definitely just a great place to be. Also, it's a great conference. It's a great people come from the Arab Gulf region is such an incredible place for specialty coffee. Some of the most beautiful cafes, beautiful coffees, roasters like Archers, in the UAE, and Cartel I mentioned, Espresso Lab, phenomenal. Saudi Arabia, you have Sulalat, and you have Caffeine Lab in Jeddah, and you have Andes and Khubar. In Kuwait, 48 East, and Earth Cafe, in Egypt, Cairo Coffee Collective. Like every country in Qatar, Nomad and Cherry Beans. And these coffees, because there's not a huge alcohol culture in the Arab Gulf, you can go in Saudi Arabia, for example. I'll never forget, to a hotel. It was midnight, and I went downstairs. There was a cafe that had geisha espresso shots. Like
Oh my
they
goodness.
open all them to midnight. I spent 24 hours. So there's that whole thing. And then because it's located in the middle of the world, basically, you have people, my friends like Pebble and James from Pebble in Taiwan, and Black Gold, and Mr. Wang, my friends from Korea come, and all over it. Kantaro from Japan, and my friends from Europe. It's a great meeting place for people. So it's a unique, obviously the SCA conference in the US is wonderful, but I find it's interesting seeing a lot more movement and more. I think people are pushing the envelope further in these regions. Here in the US,
Yeah.
it's sad. You don't see a lot of, like, you see some roasters that have special releases. There are very few, Blendin or Proud Mary or George Howell, or the few that have like these special releases. But to be able to go to a cafe at 11 p.m., 10 p.m. and see these incredible, and just the culture is, we say it's popping. It's the
Yeah.
whole vibe. People are like, young people are out there, and it's just, you gotta go to Dubai, go to Jeddah, go to like Kuwait, and go out at night and go to a cafe and just see the scene if you can.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it's as the world just becomes more multicultural as well. We tend to. I've been asking a question to different producers, sort of what are the coffees that serve different markets, right? What is the coffee that you might produce for China or Japan or the UAE or for the UK? Like, because each has kind of a profile of coffee, right? But I think it's the wrong question because there's so much kind of multicultural elements layered in each of these places at this point. What you just said in the Middle East, I know has been true in London. It's blown my mind as an American moving to London. So I'd show up at Harrods. They have a beautiful coffee bar at Harrods with expensive coffees. And I showed up at, I think it was 7, 8 o'clock at night, and the place was packed, absolutely packed. And then we did a cupping at Calico Coffee for these coffees, these Dubai coffees, last week. And they at 5 o'clock, they were kicking people out who were drinking. You're talking about 15, 20 pound cups of coffee. That's a $20, 8 ounce cup of coffee that people were drinking. It's a different world now, right? So
I
I'd
walked
be,
into a special guest and I just saw the most incredible list of coffees there. And you're right. There's a different type of, like, there's multicultures. Like, you can go to Omotesando, very Japanese vibe in London. You can go
yeah.
to, Harrods and have a different experience there too.
But they're packed late at night, whereas it used to, things usually kind of start shutting down in the U.S. and coffee shops traditionally around 1 or 2, maybe it goes to 4, that sort of thing. Starbucks changed that a little bit, but I'm hoping what you said about it being the third space, I'm hoping that comes back with all of this sort of reinvigorated energy back in a specialty. Maybe it just looks a little bit different. It just looks more like an afternoon or evening drink for some reason.
It's starting to change. Like, there's like, there's a cafe called Teremia Coffee. It's a friend of mine, Ulysses, Mexican-American, super smart, amazing guy. And they have, I think 20 locations now, mostly in SoCal and LA. And interesting thing with them is that I think in the past, people thought, oh, Mexicans or Latinos don't drink coffee. No, they do. And so their coffee culture, they have tres leches muffins, they have horchata lattes. And a lot of times I went there at night, and some of them are open to like 10, 11 p.m. And instead of going to watch a movie, some of them go with their families and sit down and have coffee with their families, kids, the grandparents, all together. It's so different than cafes where it's like, in and out, and there's like no chargers, and it's like, he's designed in that way. He also has, a lot of them are like, a lot of them used to be, I think, Taco Bell's or KFC's, and the drive-through. So he kept
Yeah.
the drive, which helped during the pandemic. And there was a couple, I remember he changed the bucket to a coffee cup. Um, so started to see that kind of change in these cafes, but not as much as like Dubai. Really, the Arab Gulf really is like how beautiful these cafes look like when you go into them. Hoof, for example, it's a cafe, or a few others that they're just like really beautiful. And I've not seen, even the consumer, they're becoming more sophisticated. Like, I think La Marzocco, a friend of mine told me that one of the highest amounts of private consumers of La Marzocco are in the UAE.
Yeah.
And they're
I
they're
believe
getting
that.
they're getting custom ordered, funky, really fun, like, espresso machines in their homes, because it's also a big part of the culture.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I did wanna ask you a question, on that a little bit. So, um, moving into sort of your story on how you've taken Yemeni coffee and it was, I wouldn't say defective, but not processed well, and then you turn it into this kind of high specialty item, right? You learn from Panama, you learn from Ethiopia, you've learned from all these other great producers. curious in kind of the biggest lessons that you sort of beg, borrowed, and steal, or you beg, borrowed, and stolen from them, that have kind of helped build up Yemeni coffee to fit these high specialty markets.
It's like the Yemen coffee always had this romantic place in the mind, the history of coffee. Even if you look at books like All About Coffee, Yerker's like a 1922 edition, it talks about Yemen coffee, and it's one of the best in the world, it says. And so I I grew up in around third wave when it first started to come out in like 2012, 2013, and I went to a cafe and I had a cup of Ethiopian Sugar Chef Natural that just blew me away. I talk about this cup all the time. It's just the same. It's just, and a lot of us in coffee have that first cup from somewhere. A lot of time it is Ethiopia coffee, just blueberries and honeysuckle. It was just something very different. I thought they put flavor in it, and then the barista was like, "No, this is the way told me taste." And he told me about his they have a direct relationship with the producing community that does this coffee. And so I started going to these cafes, and the first person I got connected to, Stephen Vick, was the green buyer at the time for Blue Bottle, and now he's in Kenya doing amazing work. I think I was annoying him so much. He just like, you know what, you should talk to this guy. He like pushed me away to this guy named his name was Graciano Cruz, and I emailed him, and he didn't respond for like a couple of weeks, and then he finally did. He was in some coffee farm in Ethiopia for a while, and then he told me to go to this one place in LA, and I went to this event, and I met all these different people. And so I got lucky that I, befriended these farmers, and, I kept hearing from a lot of old coffee buyers like Martin Dietrich and Bob Fulmer and James
Yeah.
Freeman even, that the best coffee they had was a Yemen, one of the best, like 10 or 20 years ago. But they haven't been able to find a good Yemen for so long because the lack of transparency. There's like a big distance. Like no one can go to Yemen because of the conflicts and language barrier and terrain, right? And so these beautiful gems, because of the lack of communication, and this happens a lot in our industry, whenever you have more communication between producers and consumers, it's always better. It's like
Yeah.
this, like, oh, what's working? Do you guys want more natural, more washed? Do you want these flavors? And then if you start getting into more details, like, should I dry it at 11% moisture or 10%? How many days are you drying it? What kind of level of red are you picking the coffee cherries? And those kind of things. And so um, I learned about Ethiopian coffee and Panama coffee in particular. And I was like, these guys produce these amazing coffees. What are they doing? And they told me, we're doing this, we're doing that. And so I said, let me go and do this in Yemen, see what happens, because we already have the natural uh, formula for success: extremely high elevation, really interesting varieties, old roots, and we just need a bit of this kind of knowledge transfer. And so I think, and by the way, initially I didn't mean to like go to Yemen. I thought I can just work with an exporter or importer here, and I couldn't find any importer that knew where their coffee came from. It had this weird name, Arabian Mocha Sanani, which doesn't make there's no area in Yemen called that. And so then I went to exporters, and I realized, that 40% of Yemen coffee was not really Yemen coffee. It was smuggled from other East African countries and repackaged. And so then I went down to the farm level, and I realized every way along the route, coffees get mixed, and, most farmers sell coffee that's 2, 3, 4 years old,
Yeah.
and so if you're a farmer that has a special variety, a great elevation, you've picked the coffee perfectly, your coffee gets
Lost.
mixed with some other farmer and it gets
Yeah.
lost. And so I had to go to 32 regions across Yemen the first year and a half, just go into these places, understand the variety, the elevation, what makes these coffees unique, and also just to meet the people and understand them. Then we cup the coffees, and we figured 2 regions that made sense to start working with. And then, then just a process of like experimentation. But it really helped me that I didn't start from scratch, that I had farmers that I can lean to from other countries, particularly Panama, who, they've they've been at this for like, 20 plus years now, some of them. And our coffees had certain things that gave us an edge. The varieties are very, unique and rare, the elevation. Also, it's very arid and it's very dry. And so the coffees are under a lot of stress, coffee trees. And that stress makes the coffee plant produce more acids and more complexity. It's just, makes coffee really unique. And so, pretty much, and it's just trial and error. And then, in the last couple of years, going into a bit more fermentation and some slow drying. I mean, a lot of our experiments do not come out good, just to be honest with you. They're like acidic acid development. It's if you develop it too much, it becomes like a vinegar and tastes so bad, And so it's trying to figure out, this space. That's why my farm is a small farm. I get to do these experiments and see what works, what doesn't work. I don't want farmer to risk that. So that's kind of been my success has been in that. And even just like there's a lot of like people who believe in the coffee who told me, gave me good advice. A friend of mine, Antoine from France, he in 2014, he cupped my coffee. He was one of the first people who tasted it. And I was actually very nervous because I hadn't really tasted it alongside other coffees before. And so he was like, this is just as good as these coffees from Panama and actually better because it has these flavor notes and it's so unique. And then of course when I launched, I got very lucky with wonderful roasters, like some of the best roasters with around the world who took my coffee beans, and that's another part, the science of roasted unlocking the flavor, and they were just really wonderful people. Our first launch with Blue Bottle, it was a $16 cup of coffee, which this was 2015, I think it was, or 16. It was the first time a coffee had sold that price ever in the US. And, the first week of that launch, we received 40 million online impressions from articles and people that were just like,
Wow.
what's
Yeah.
going they like the coffee. Actually, a lot of them wanted to go in and write a review, a horrible review about this ridiculous, like pretentious coffee. Why is it $16? But they were blown away by how it tasted and the story behind it. And James Freeman, and they were so intuitive, and they launched the coffee with a cookie based off of my mom's recipe of cardamom, black seeds, and
Oh,
then a
man,
small
sounds
booklet.
amazing.
It
Yeah.
was a small booklet, accordion booklet with the story in it. It was like it was just a mouth, and they asked me to co-brand with them. They didn't just take my coffee and put Yemen. They actually put my name, Porter Milk, on, which they had not done, and and it was roasted amazing. It was served. It was the whole experience was really cool, and it taught me the power of storytelling. Nowadays we see like every month or quarter at least there's a special release coffee. But at that time, that didn't happen. So it's wonderful seeing that that continue in other roasters now. But yeah, again, like my journey has just really been an evolution and just being around great teachers and people who kind of guided me in certain ways. And for me also, because I didn't come from this background, I had a lot of bad ideas, but I also had a lot of good ideas that no one thought about. And it came in from a different perspective, and that helped me a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, are you, because we've had this conversation with other producers, but are you still as aggressively experimenting as you used to? Or are you finding that there seems to just be sort of this, hey, let's kind of take what the environment and the microclimate gives us, and let's, not try and screw that up. Like, where do you fall on that? Because you seem like the kind of guy who likes to experiment, innovate, try new things, all that. I get sucked into that, but that's just part of the nature of growing a company, right? Where do you fall in that?
It's funny. I think a lot of people, and especially coffee, relate to this. When we first get into coffee and we first start tasting like fermented coffee, we love like the loud, explosive things. And as our palates become more refined, we start to like notice, actually, no, we want more elegant and more refined flavors. And then we want to bring out the origin a bit more. And so it's like you said, and it's a lot of new coffee consuming countries, when they get into coffee, I see this trend going to super fermented and then they finally like kind of slow down. And so for me, it's interesting. At the end of the day, it's I think the goal is to bring out the best of the coffee origin and what makes that coffee special. Because if you just ferment it, um, you lose that uniqueness, and it just becomes like you don't know what it is. It could be Colombia, it could be just super fermented. And also after I visited that vineyard and I saw the amount of science that's inputted into this, world, and I like, in the coffee world, we unfortunately use these ridiculous names, double semi, like, yeah, I don't know, like flux capacitor process. Like
Yeah.
we make up these funny names to make ourselves unique, and it's not scientific. It just, we just want to like double, triple natural. Like I don't know what that means, or so it's just to be honest, like a lot of these experiments are not based on a scientific process. There's a specific scientific process, hypothesis. There's a way to do something, to do it, and you should connect with local chemical engineers or people in your in industry. And I see a lot of coffee farmers doing that now. It's not the case in all of them. I know one roaster who went to a coffee farm. I'm not going to name the farm. They had a fermentation tank with a bunch of moscata, like the liquid, yeast in it. And he drank a little bit or smelled it, and it made him sick, like for like several weeks. That's how in it. So it's also a health issue, I think. So I think that I've tasted some amazing coffees that are processed, and I think the process now is becoming more refined. People are now talking about what's your pH level, what's the temperature control now. The dark rooms, which are really cool. Like it's starting to become more than just like putting it in a barrel and just closing it for a few days and seeing what happens. Because that, to be honest, is the truth. What many, and including myself, did in the beginning. We just kind of like threw it in there and kind of rushed with it. What's going to
Yeah.
happen now? And to be honest, it was not, and we produced some horrible coffees that way. Sometimes we got a few that were really unique, but we can't. The problem with that is you can't replicate it because you didn't know how to control it in the first place. So for me, to answer your question, I tend to I want people to taste the coffee and know this is from Yemen. It's like my goal to do that. And I would say this, the naturally processed coffee from Yemen, we might do sometimes slow and dry where we cover it from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., the highest point of sunlight. So it dries slower. It has a longer shelf life. The embryo converts more starch to sugars. It's unique. It's way harder to produce coffee like that. But it's incredible, the flavor. And when you do these like artificial flavors or super fermented, it's like steroids. You're going to get jacked up, but there's a lot of side effects.
Yeah.
And something you don't want to have. And so that's my thing. So it's like, I still have some coffees I want to experiment every year to push the envelope and do that. I know that 30% of those experiments are going to fail. What I've seen in my data, but I want to do that. But I
Yeah.
also want to produce there's nothing better to me like than a clean, natural from Yemen that has, like, especially when the area is very dry and it's high elevation and it's the Odeni variety, it produces this tropical sweet, like hard candy flavor with this beautiful body, and I can never replicate that as a fermented coffee. But it's very hard to produce that. Like it's not, and I can only produce a small amount of coffee that way. So I've seen like some people take coffees from low elevations and bad varieties, so to speak, and do some experiments to bring up their qualities. In Myanmar, my friend Marcelo, incredible project in Myanmar, he took these coffees that are very low elevation. I think it was the SN51 variety. It was low elevation, and he fermented them. Because they were picking red cherries, they were doing everything correctly, but it was still like 83, 84 points because it was low elevation. The variety wasn't that great. And with the fermentation, he jumped them up to 88, 87 points. And that was like amazing. So in that regards, but
Wow.
I definitely push for that, whatever will help a farmer, I would say.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that. It is good to see kind of innovation, and some of these debates, like you said, we're all trying to move in the same direction. It does help the farmer. Let's do that. I am excited to see more engineers um, to enter the world of coffee. I'm excited to see more PhDs. Even excited to see some more lawyers enter the world of coffee to help us with some of these definitions, right? They're just getting passionate about coffee, leaving their old careers and getting into this, which is really nice to see. But anyway, so Mokhtar, you have two lots on auction with us in this Dubai coffee auction. It will happen on February 10th and February 11th. We are excited to partner with you on that. We are excited to see and hear about the processing methods that have gone into these amazing coffees on that auction. I just thank you so much for your time today. I will do one more shout out. It doesn't need it because it's one of few books, unfortunately, on specialty coffee, but definitely worth a read. The Monk of Mokha. There's so many good lessons in that. Keep the money in your hand, never in your heart. Admit the error and correct it. No excuses. Values first. Dress up. Work
Wow.
harder. Just really good, like heartwarming messages along with a story of Yemeni coffee. So thank you for living that experience so the rest of us, one, don't have to and can enjoy it in this wonderful work. And thank you for your partnership on this Dubai coffee auction this year.
This is one of my favorite conversations I've ever had. It's wonderful talking to my own community members, because a lot of times I speak to people in the coffee industry, and it means a lot to me that you actually read my book and that you really like understood it in a way that a lot of people don't, and that's because I think talks about you when you, I guess when you read something, you really get into it. But thank you so much for this conversation. It's very honest, and I hope I was helpful. I'm really excited to be part of this. I think, as I mentioned, I think it is an historic event. It's wonderful to see my friends and us all hanging out in the same coffee boxes, and I think that should be a fun auction. I'm looking forward to tasting these coffees, and for those who are looking for some of the world's best coffee, this is a really unique experience to be part of. I hope you guys consider participating, and may the best coffee win.
Absolutely. Well, we will see you in Dubai. Maybe. Sounds like leaning yes, but it would be great to shake your hand and cup some coffees. So I hope so.
Definitely. Thanks so much.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.